really a new perspective about food. It's essentially a nutrition and dietetics course, but its scope is quite broad. We actually start with a unit called Working as a Microbiologist, understanding and looking at food from the perspective of both microbes, the impact of good and bad microbes, but also from the perspective of hygiene. So we actually have a range of microbes that are really important for the development of a huge range of foods. And we look at also the role of enzymes, essentially proteins that act as catalysts that speed up the maturation of food, which we want, but often take food beyond a point at which it's healthy or good to eat. And so that unit really involves some station work. We actually prepare a range of foods. We look at concepts such as the critical temperature zone and cross-contamination. One of the areas that is very significant in Australia is the incidence of food poisoning. We have a huge number of people, around about 5.5 million people a year who suffer from food poisoning. It has a significant economic cost on the Australian economy. And so it really is an indication that there is the need for an understanding of how to prepare food safely, store it safely, prevent cross-contamination. And there have been some really significant and quite alarming food poisoning cases in Australia. So we look at some of those particular cases and how that actually came about. Our next unit is working as a food technologist, recognising that in the creation of food, there is in fact a lot of chemistry that takes place. So we unpack some of those chemical reactions, recognising that food is made up of nutrients, proteins, carbs, and fats are our macronutrients, and it's those nutrients that take part in the chemical reactions. And so students get to experiment with food, develop a range of products, and unpack some of those chemical reactions themselves in products that they've actually created. We're also interested in the technologies that play a role in the processing of our food, and not only looking at the technologies and how they change our food, such as extrusion technology, but how that also then plays out on our health, because often as food is processed, certain nutrients are removed, such as fibre, and certain nutrients are added, such as salts and sugars, and we actually end up with a whole range of diseases that are quite common for West because of the style of ultra processed or fully processed foods within our diet. Within that range of foods is also the use of food additives. They have a really important role, but they also have some negative impacts on health, certain ones in particular, like such as monosodium glutamate. And we look at, we do a case study around corn chips and having a look at the specific types that are used. Our next unit, we actually work as an anthropologist, and we're really studying here and examining here the role of migrant groups. But first of all, our wonderful and deep history that Indigenous culture and heritage has brought to cultural cuisine of Australia. So we actually use a range of Indigenous ingredients to create some food products. We do some station work also around iconic Australian foods, look at some of those histories associated with it. In some of these photos that are on this screen is students' work on creating their own version of Monte Carlo's and Arnott's biscuit. That was, obviously it's an iconic food. One of the experiences is doing an excursion that we call a food safari excursion, and unpacking the migrant story, that often there's some wonderful food businesses that have family history where the first generation of that family came to Australia and started up wonderful food businesses. And so we hear these migrant stories and get to taste some of the wonderful foods. Year 9 finishes off with a celebrations unit, and but throughout the year we also, as you can see, there's some Easter cakes there. In Year 10, we look at food equity and social justice, a much bigger picture of food production around the world. We're really wanting to come to terms also with the impact of food insecurity and what that means for health and disease in third world countries, the impact of the poverty cycle and what we also refer to as the malnutrition cycle. We consider the role of World Vision, a very incredible organisation that has established a program called Seeds of Hope that is truly bringing changes to some communities, particularly in Ethiopia, with a hand up rather than a handout economic development. So we look at that. One of the concerning areas that we examine is global food supply and how, in some cases, and with some foods, and there's more than chocolate, but chocolate is one of our case study foods, often adds to inequity and social justice with the use of child labour. So that's an area that we examine. Another unit we look at is extreme nutrition. So looking at this time at first world, because we do pick up on some of this in the previous unit where we look at undernutrition in third world countries, and undernutrition in first world is very different. Again, we look at overnutrition as part of malnutrition. So we look at morbid obesity and super morbid obesity and the conditions associated with that, such as type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. Undernutrition in first world countries can often look very extreme, such as anorexia and bulimia. And we are considering the physiological, the social, the economic impact of these diseases. So not just sort of finding out about them, but also understanding how they play out and what can be some of the long-term impacts. Looking here in this particular unit called Foods, Fads, Fallacies and Fashion, we're really interested in how culture, religion, belief systems change our perception or shape our perception of what is acceptable as food. And it's also a unit where we want to understand a little bit more deeply about the impact of nutrients. And so it leads us into examining visceral fat. We look at fad diets, orthorexia and freeganism being one of them. And then we finish with a styling unit, a food styling unit. And it's a nice way to finish. So it's a wonderful course that will make you a little bit more of an expert in nutrition and dietetics while giving you very much hands-on experience, giving you an insight that food is more than just cooking it, but really understanding many of the nutrients behind it and its impact on our health.